Hello, everyone, and welcome back to episode 2 of season 4, The Future Rewritten of the EloEllie podcast. Thank you once again for joining us. And today, as previously noted, we'll be talking about US hot button topics. Now, what are hot button topics? These are topics that are highly controversial, and these one policy that voters are looking towards. So today we'll be covering various topics: abortion, gun reform, police reform, book bans, social media bans, and the legalization of marijuana. And in covering these topics, please know that this will be a completely apolitical discussion that talks about both the Democrats and Republicans, and regardless of your political view, I hope you can look at this as a simple assessment of why these topics are so sensitive and why they're so important to the US current events and the future as a whole. So now, let's get started. First, we're going to talk about abortion. This is a very sensitive topic for a lot of listeners. Now we're going to talk about the two parties, and please note that there are always different opinions. And these two parties don't always represent all of those party followers' opinions either, but these are simply the central opinions that they believe in. The Democratic Party tends to lean towards the pro-choice side of abortion, believing that women should be given a choice when deciding whether they're going to have an abortion or not. The Republicans tend to lean towards the pro-life side of abortion, hence saying that women past 6 weeks shouldn't be able to get an abortion because it's stripping the rights of the fetus inside the woman's stomach. However, what we have to realize with the abortion topic and debate is that what's largely being ignored is the woman in the discussion. Both the youth and women in general have not been largely included in abortion discussions. Even our Supreme Court decision, the statements that were made were largely by the white males in the Supreme Court. And the lack of diversity within the Supreme Court isn't exactly the fault of the system. However, when looking at it generally, we can realize that the reason why abortion is such an important topic for women is not only because it determines their rights, but because they haven't been listened to. When politicians are talking about abortion or asked about it, they try their best to stay apolitical or to avoid the topic altogether. And they do this so as not to anger any party or any person. And whereas this is good and productive, at the same time, this means that we're always skirting around the issue of abortion. Now, some people who believe that abortion should be banned or mostly restricted say that this is for the sake of the fetuses. But a lot of women are voicing the opinion that when we take out certain cases like rape and sexual assault, we end up allowing women to continue being sexually assaulted and forcing to have the perpetrators children. And the problem in of itself is that a lot of the time the police doesn't fully admit sexual assault or rape in a lot of cases, which means that women who are raped and sexually assaulted are legally not. But this means that if they go in to get an abortion, they might be restricted from doing so because technically the legal documents say that they were never raped in the first place. But this doesn't change the fact that it was simply the police that didn't admit it, not that that woman wasn't sexually assaulted. And the loophole within the system is the reason why abortion and the topic around it has been touchy for a lot of voters. And especially for youth voters, this topic is increasingly important, as after the overturning of Roe v. Wade, we are the newest generation that will directly walk into the effects of the overturning of that central Supreme Court case by allowing states to rule on what they believe abortion restrictions should be. But now, let's move away from abortion into gun reform and gun control. This, once again, has been a hot topic within the Supreme Court and within the government in general, with President Biden promising to have gun reform and gun control and President Trump promising to open it up to US citizens. The problem lies within the fact that Americans do have the constitutional right to bear arms. But the question is, what is the line at which bearing arms is a constitutional right, and it's also a great danger for the American people. The reason why a lot of people disagree about gun reform is one, because of their political stance, but two, because the way that guns present themselves in cultures within America are vastly different. Certain cultures, like where I'm from, don't largely use guns, and they're scrutinized when they're used within the community. But other cultures, they're used in simple daily activities, learned when you're in your childhood, as a part of hunting. And in doing so, the clash of cultures makes certain people feel like they're having their rights stripped away, whereas other people feel threatened by the use of guns because they haven't widely used it. So I guess having variety of cultures and thoughts within America is great for its cultivation and productivity as a whole, but also can hold back the nation when trying to find a middle ground. And a lot of politicians say that gun reform and gun control will never be possible. And this is something that's largely debated, because given the fact that gun violence is one of the greatest killers within Americans, and going further, guns are the number one leading cause of death within the youth, whereas a lot of adults and politicians don't believe guns are that important and believe that they're a constitutional right that the youth are trying to strip away, our generation is being hit by the use of guns. And there are always root causes behind why guns are being used. And whereas it may be impossible to completely ban guns, a lot of the youth believe that there still needs to be control, at least an effort to restrict the sale and use of guns. Because as you probably know, there are hundreds of school shootings and mass shootings every single year. And every single time a school is shot down, we put it on the news, we talk about how we need to stop it, and then we move on. But the truth is that the people who are being murdered in mass numbers are our children, are our future. So for youth voters, gun reform and gun control is a policy beyond just politics. It could be a matter of life or death for them, and even for future generations. But on the term side of gun control and gun reform, related to it is the police. Because the question of underfunding the police, especially after police brutality incidents occurred, have also been a big topic. And it's really undeniable, whether you're red or blue, that police brutality is real. As we saw through the murder of George Floyd and too many other cases, the police are quickly trained to take out their guns whenever they're threatened. And a lot of the times, although their voluntary response is to shoot guns, their involuntary response is once again to simply take out their guns. Hence why this connects to the gun reform policy question. And then there are the police officers who brutally murder civilians based on their race or gender, which was the case of George Floyd. And it can't be really disputed between any party about the fact that the police do need to change, but the disagreement appears there. Some people believe that the police just need to be completely underfunded. A new system has to be developed, while others believe that we can increase education within the police and make sure that guns aren't the first response that the police go to, especially when dealing with situations that they don't always need to use their guns. And also, teaching them how to deal with people who might be suffering from mental illness. And these are a variety of ways that our police can change. But within that problem is once again the gridlocking between the Democrats and the Republicans. The hot button topics are never resolved, not necessarily because there's no middle ground between those two different ideas, but because our Senate, House of Representatives, President, Supreme Court, any court within the United States is too busy fighting amongst one another on whether this is a red issue or blue issue. But in the process of doing so, the byproducts of this gridlocking within our US government is the reason why these hot button topics only get more controversial. But next, let's move on to talking about book bans and social media bans. So book bans occurred largely in 2020 after a mainly conservative group compiled a list of books that lean towards liberal thinking and banned them from schools and libraries all around the states. And in doing so, people are now arguing if this is constitutionally valid. Are they allowed to strip these books from a public school and public library just because they lean more towards liberal views? And the question in of itself is once again affecting the youth. The youth are having their books taken away. The youth are given cherry-picked information on the Democrats' or Republicans' view. And this topic is way beyond whether the liberals or conservatives are doing it. It's about how we're stripping the right to education and knowledge from our children. Because whereas some people argue that these books have mass profanity or lewd scenes, that's not necessarily true. Some books need to be restricted from children because they may contain child pornography or lewd language that children shouldn't be exposed to, as the Constitution states. But other types of political expression is free expression that shouldn't be restricted. And this similar ideology appeals to current social media bans that are being talked about. TikTok, Instagram are all under fire for their largely politicized contents, and especially TikTok has been banned by the US government. They say that if TikTok doesn't move over its Chinese bike company to the United States, then they're going to ban it from the Apple Store, the Google Play Store, so that basically American consumers can't download and use the app without getting it from the black market. But this problem is once again the question of whether this counts as censorship, because just because we're concerned about China surveilling American citizens through TikTok doesn't necessarily mean that we can strip them of their right to expression on the app. Which is why free speech is once again becoming a hot button issue with book bans and social media. It's unpredictable which way the Supreme Court will really rule, and largely it's predicted that they'll probably err on the safer side of allowing more freedom of speech than less. But the youth are simply concerned that the adults and the politicians are ruling on what they believe the youth should be learning, on what they believe the youth should be saying on social media. But that's not really for those politicians to decide, even if we may disagree with what the youth are saying. And lastly, I want to talk about probably a completely different topic of the legalization of marijuana. The war on drugs and the overall legalization of drugs has been a hot button issue for a very long time. And honestly, a lot of youth now believes the legalization of marijuana is not happening anytime soon. But I still think that it's important to talk about it. The opioid crisis within the United States just shows how many teenagers and youth in general in college and their undergraduate, graduate students are addicted to drugs. And the US government is hoping that through the legalization of marijuana, a lesser form of drugs, people will be able to use it for medical reasons because marijuana does actually have medical health reasons that are helpful, and also use it in less quantities. In doing so, there's an ideology within the youth that whatever the government does, if they're a user, they will continue to find access to it. But because there's relatively little attention being given to the current drug crisis, especially amongst the youth, this problem is going a little bit quiet. There are occasional news articles when a youth member decides to take his own life or dies of overdose when our media talks about it. But other than that, it's overshadowed by our political events. But I think that these are the topics that we need to talk about as a youth and as a community, and especially our politicians, because lives are on the line, either by creating reform on our drug laws or creating better rehab facilities. We need a way to get the youth off of the mass use of drugs. This is a future written by the youth. A future where we can talk about these hot button topics without getting too heated over it and find a middle ground. Because if we never talk about these topics, then we're never going to come to a consensus about how we're going to move forward. And because lives are on the line, abortion or women's rights, and possible women who will lose their lives in a medical emergency because they can't get an abortion, gun reforms pertaining to school shootings, police reforms pertaining to police brutality, book bans and social media pertaining to the free speech rights of the youth, and the drug crisis pertaining to overdoses. All of these hot button topics at the end of the day are connected back to our youth population. So, as our podcast motto is, our youth are going to rewrite the future to how we're going to talk about these topics. And this episode is simply one way that I'm trying to raise awareness about why these topics are so sensitive and why they're so important as one policy voters for a youth population. So, thank you everyone for joining us on episode 2 of season 4, The Future Rewritten, where we talked about the US hot button topics. And next week, we'll be talking about the environment and how the environment will pass on to our next generation. So until then, I hope you enjoyed this podcast episode. You can always email me at 2eloquentellie.com. Find my website, EloEllie.com. You can always submit a contact form or reach out to this podcast in any way that you want to. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'll see you next time.